The early morning sun peeked through the dusty windows of Sally's diner, casting long shadows across the worn checkered floor. Frank Thompson, at 93 years old, pushed open the heavy glass door with hands that had seen nearly a century of life's challenges. The small brass bell above the door chimed softly, announcing his arrival just as it had every morning for the past 15 years. "Morning, Frank," called Sally from behind the counter. She was already pouring his coffee into the familiar blue mug with a small chip on its handle. At 6:45 a.m. sharp, like clockwork, Frank would take his usual seat in the third booth from the door. The vinyl seats had molded themselves to his frame over the years, creating a comfortable spot that felt like home. Frank's weathered fingers smoothed down his neatly pressed plaid shirt as he settled into his seat. His Marine Corps pin, polished every Sunday evening, caught the morning light from its permanent place on his collar. The daily newspaper lay folded on the table, placed there by Tommy, the young busboy who made sure everything was perfect for the diner's oldest regular customer. "Here's your coffee, Frank," Sally said, placing the steaming mug in front of him. She noticed how his wedding ring still gleamed on his finger, even though Margaret had been gone for 15 years now. "Toast and eggs coming right up, extra crispy, just how you like them." Frank nodded with a gentle smile. His blue eyes, though faded with age, still held a sharp clarity that spoke of a mind that refused to dim. He unfolded his newspaper with careful precision, a habit formed during his military days where everything had its proper place and order. The morning routine was more than just breakfast for Frank. It was his anchor to the world since Margaret's passing. The walls of Sally's diner held 15 years of memories. The last breakfast he shared with Margaret before her final hospital stay. The morning Sally and her staff helped him celebrate his 90th birthday, and countless quiet moments with his newspaper and thoughts. Other regulars began filtering in, each nodding respectfully to Frank as they passed his booth. There was Bob the mailman, Maria the school teacher, and old Joe from the hardware store. They all knew Frank's story, how he'd served in World War II, raised 3 children with Margaret, and worked for 40 years at the town's lumber mill before retiring. As Frank sipped his coffee, his eyes drifted to the small photo he kept in his wallet. It showed a much younger version of him. The peaceful mornings at Sally's diner changed the day 10 motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their chrome pipes gleaming under the morning sun. The riders, wearing black leather jackets with Road Warriors patches, filed into the diner just as Frank Thompson was midway through his morning coffee. The bell above the door chimed repeatedly as they entered, but this time it wasn't the gentle sound Frank had grown accustomed to. The biker's heavy boots thumped against the checkered floor, and their loud voices bounced off the walls. Sally, behind the counter, gripped her coffee pot tighter, watching as they claimed the tables nearest to Frank's usual spot. "Hey, Grandpa, what's today's news?" one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Frank kept his eyes fixed on his newspaper, pretending not to hear. The biker, a tall man with a skull tattoo on his neck, nudged his friend and snickered. Tommy, the young busboy, almost dropped his tray of dishes when the bikers demanded service. "Coffee, kid, and make it snappy," they shouted, causing several regular customers to flinch. The peaceful atmosphere that had defined Sally's diner for years evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. The bikers made themselves comfortable, spreading out across 3 tables. Their leather jackets creaked as they leaned back in their chairs, boots propped up on empty seats. The leader, who called himself Bullied, kept glancing at Frank's booth with an unsettling. Frank Thompson sat alone in his small living room, staring at Margaret's picture on the mantel. The morning light filtered through his lace curtains. Curtains Margaret had picked out 30 years ago. It was 6:45 a.m., his usual time to be at Sally's diner, but today he couldn't bring himself to go. The thought of facing those bikers again made his hands shake. His daughter Linda had called last night, sensing something was wrong in her father's voice during their weekly call. "Dad, you don't sound like yourself," she had said, but Frank couldn't tell her about the bikers. His generation didn't complain about their problems. They endured them quietly. At Sally's diner, his empty booth spoke volumes. Sally kept glancing at the door, hoping to see his familiar figure, but knowing why he wasn't there. The bikers had claimed their usual tables, louder than ever in Frank's absence. "Looks like we finally got rid of the old-timer," Bullied announced, spreading his arms across the booth that had been Frank's for 15 years. His gang members laughed, but Sally noticed one of them, a younger biker named Joey, looking uncomfortable. Tommy, the busboy, was clearing tables with more force than necessary. He'd grown fond of Frank over the years, admiring how the veteran would sometimes share stories about his war days when Tommy asked. Now, the diner felt wrong without Frank's quiet presence. In his house, Frank tried to maintain his routine. He made coffee in his old percolator and unfolded the newspaper Tommy had started delivering to his door. But it wasn't the same. The coffee didn't taste like Sally's, and the newspaper felt heavy in his hands without the familiar sounds of the diner around him. He looked at his Marine Corps medals displayed in their case on the wall. Each one represented a time when he had faced fear and overcome it. But this was different. He wasn't a young Marine anymore, and these weren't enemy soldiers. These were Americans, young men who should know better. Back at the diner, the regular customers had developed their own coping strategies. Maria, the school teacher, now grabbed her coffee to go. Bob, the mailman, started visiting a different diner across town. Even Joe from the hardware store, a big man who wasn't easily intimidated, had changed his routine to avoid confrontation. Sally tried her best to maintain order. She instituted new rules about noise levels and proper seating etiquette, but the bikers ignored them. When she threatened to call the police, they reminded her they were paying customers who hadn't broken any laws. Frank spent his mornings looking out his front window, watching the town wake up from a distance. He saw parents walking their children to school, shop owners opening their stores, and life continuing without him. Sometimes he caught himself reaching for his cane, ready to make the familiar walk to Sally's, before remembering why he couldn't. The diner's morning regulars started meeting at the local church basement to have coffee together, but it wasn't the same. They missed the warm atmosphere of Sally's, the smell of fresh bacon, and most of all, they missed Frank's steady presence. One morning, Frank found himself polishing his service pins out of habit. His fingers traced the Marine Corps emblem, remembering the day he'd earned it. He thought about his commanding officer's words. A Marine never backs down from a fight, but he also knows how to choose his battles wisely. Sally had taken to calling Frank every evening, checking on him. She told him about the diner, trying to keep him connected to the place that had been his second home. She didn't mention the bikers, but they both knew they were the reason for these calls. The weights of loneliness and helplessness pressed down on Frank harder each day. His morning coffee grew cold in its cup as he sat in his quiet house, missing the familiar sounds of Sally's diner. The walls of his home seemed to close in, making him feel every bit of his 93 years. Tommy started spending his break time sitting on Frank's porch, bringing him day-old muffins from the diner and updates about the regulars. He never mentioned the bikers, but his angry expression when he talked about the morning rush told Frank everything he needed to know. As days turned into weeks, something began to change in Frank. The silent suffering was becoming too heavy to bear. Every morning, as he looked at Margaret's picture, he could almost hear her voice saying, "Sometimes, Frank, being brave isn't about fighting. It's about standing your ground." Little did anyone know, Frank Thompson was about to do exactly that. On a chilly Tuesday morning, Frank Thompson made his decision. After 3 weeks of avoiding Sally's diner, he put on his best plaid shirt, pinned his Marine Corps badge to his collar, and grabbed his cane. His hands were steady as he combed his silver hair. Something had changed in his eyes when he looked in the mirror that morning. The familiar bell chimed as Frank pushed open the diner's door at exactly 6:45 a.m. Sally nearly dropped her coffee pot when she saw him. The regular customers who had dared to stay whispered among themselves, watching as Frank made his way to his usual booth, the one Blade and his gang had claimed as their own. "Well, look who's back from the dead," Blade announced, sprawled across the booth with 2 other bikers. The rest of the gang occupied the surrounding tables, creating a wall of leather and attitude. Frank stood quietly before them, leaning on his cane, waiting. "Something wrong with your hearing aid, old man?" One of the bikers sneered. "This ain't your spot anymore." The gang members laughed, but Frank didn't move. He just stood there, his blue eyes fixed on Blade. Sally held her breath behind the counter. Tommy stopped wiping tables, clutching his rag tightly. The whole diner seemed to freeze in that moment, waiting to see what would happen next. "Hey, Grandpa, are you lost?" Blade stood up, towering over Frank. "Maybe we need to help you find your way to the retirement home." He reached for Frank's newspaper, snatching it from his hands and tearing it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the silent diner. Still, Frank didn't speak. His eyes never left Blade's face. "What's this?" Another biker reached out and flicked Frank's Marine Corps pin. Plain dress-up with military pins. How cute. He knocked Frank's coffee cup off the table, sending hot coffee splashing across the floor. The cup, the blue one with the chip that had been Frank's for 15 years, shattered on the checkered floor. Something shifted in Frank's expression as he watched the broken pieces scatter. That cup had been Margaret's favorite. She had always saved it for him, even on busy mornings. After she passed, Sally had made sure no one else ever used it. Now it lay in pieces, surrounded by spreading coffee stains. "Oh, did we break Grandpa's special cup?" Blade mocked, high-fiving his friends. "Maybe it's time for you to learn that some things need to stay in the past, old man. This is our place now." Frank looked down at the broken cup, then at the torn newspaper, and finally at his Marine Corps pin. 15 years of peaceful mornings, of memories with Margaret, of friendship with Sally, and the regulars. All of it seemed to be reflected in those broken pieces on the floor. The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped cooking to watch through the service window. Maria, the school teacher, had tears in her eyes. Bob, the mailman, stood by the door, his hand gripping his mailbag tightly. Blade took Frank's silence as victory. He turned to his gang, arms spread wide. "See, boys? That's how you handle." The sound of Frank's cane hitting the floor cut through Blade's words like a knife. Everyone watched as Frank slowly, deliberately removed his jacket. His movements were precise, practiced, the movements of a man who had once commanded respect in much darker circumstances than this. Sally gasped. In all the years Frank had been coming to her diner, she had never seen him without his jacket. Now she understood why. The rest of the customers stared, their eyes wide with surprise. Blade's smirk began to fade as he took in what everyone else was seeing. His gang members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some even backing away slightly from their tables. Frank Thompson stood straighter now, his shoulders squared despite his age. Without his jacket, everyone could see what his long sleeves had always hidden, and suddenly, the atmosphere in Sally's diner changed completely. The old veteran wasn't just some elderly man they could push around anymore. As he stood there in the morning light, surrounded by broken ceramic and spilled coffee, Frank Thompson had transformed into something else entirely, and he was about to remind everyone exactly who he was. The morning sun streaming through Sally's diner's windows illuminated what Frank's jacket had hidden for 15 years. A full sleeve of military tattoos, weathered but still clear, telling the story of his service. Most prominent was the Battle of Iwo Jima scene that covered his right forearm, showing Marines raising the flag on Mount Suravachi. But it wasn't just the tattoos that commanded attention. Even at 93, Frank's arms showed the strength of a man who had never stopped working hard. His posture had changed. No longer the quiet old man who read his morning paper, but a Marine who had led men through one of history's bloodiest battles. "You want to know about plain dress-up?" Frank's voice was steady, stronger than anyone in the diner had ever heard it. "February 19, 1945. I was 19 years old when we hit that black beach on Iwo Jima." The bikers sat frozen, their earlier bravado evaporating as Frank pointed to a specific part of his tattoo. "This here? This represents the 13 men in my platoon. Young men, like yourselves, who thought they were invincible." Sally and the other customers watched in amazement as Frank pulled up his left sleeve, revealing more tattoos, each one marking a different battle, a different story. "We spent 36 days on that island. Every morning, we woke up not knowing if we'd see the sunset." Blade had sunk back into his seat, his face pale as Frank continued. "See this number here?" Frank pointed to a series of digits inked on his arm. "That's my unit number. We were tasked with securing a civilian cave complex. Intelligence said it was empty." The diner was absolutely silent now. Even the sizzling of the grill in the kitchen had stopped as everyone listened. But it wasn't empty. Frank's voice grew softer, but no less powerful. There were 13 civilians trapped inside, women, children, elderly. They'd been hiding for days, terrified of both sides. My platoon had to make a choice. He touched another tattoo, this one showing a cave entrance with Japanese characters. "We spent 3 days protecting that cave, caught between enemy fire and our own advancing forces. Lost 4 good men keeping those civilians safe. Their names are right here." He pointed to a list of names etched into his skin. Tommy had moved closer, his cleaning rag forgotten in his hand. Maria was openly crying now, and Bob the mailman stood at attention, recognizing a fellow veteran. "You see these pins you were mocking?" Frank picked up his Marine Corps pin from his collar. Each one was earned with blood and courage. Not just mine, but the blood and courage of men better than me who never made it home. Blade's gang members were looking at their leader, then back at Frank, their earlier laughter replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. "But you know what, boys?" Frank's voice took on a teaching tone. "The real heroes weren't just the ones fighting. When we finally got those civilians to safety, an elderly Japanese man, probably about my age now, bowed to us and offered us his family's only remaining food." Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out an old, creased photo. It showed a young Marine surrounded by grateful civilians. "That man taught me something important that day. Strength isn't about intimidation. It's not about making others feel small. Real strength is about protecting those who can't protect themselves." He placed the photo on the table, next to his torn newspaper and the broken pieces of his coffee cup. "I came to this diner every morning for 15 years because my late wife, Margaret, loved it here. She taught me that peace is precious, that kindness matters, that community is what we fight for." Looking each biker in the eye, Frank spoke his final words with quiet authority. "So no, young man, I'm not playing dress-up. I earned every mark on my body and every pin on my collar. And I didn't earn them by bullying old men and making hard-working people afraid to enjoy their breakfast." The silence that followed was deafening. The morning sun had climbed higher now, making Frank's tattoo seem to come alive with stories of sacrifice, courage, and honor. The bikers looked at each other, then at their leader, waiting to see how he would respond to this unexpected turn of events. What happened next would change everything at Sally's diner. Blade stood up slowly from his seat, his face showing a mix of emotions no one in the diner had seen before. He walked towards Frank, and for a moment, everyone held their breath, fearing what might happen next. But instead of aggression, Blade's hands were shaking as he reached into his leather jacket. "Unit number 2 to 75 to 9. Blade's voice cracked as he pulled out an old, worn photograph. "Did you serve under Captain James Miller?" Frank's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the photograph Blade held out. In the faded image, a young Marine stood proudly in his uniform, a man who looked remarkably like Blade, but decades older. "That's my grandfather, sir," Blade said, his voice losing all its previous harshness. "Robert Hawk Miller. He served in Iwo Jima. He used to tell me stories about his lieutenant. The bravest man he'd ever known, a lieutenant who saved 13 civilians in a cave." The other bikers stood up now, their attitudes completely transformed. They gathered around as Frank took the photograph with careful hands, studying it closely. "Hawk Miller," Frank whispered, his eyes growing misty. "Best radioman I ever had. Saved our whole unit when the communications went down during the cave rescue." He looked up at Blade. "You have his eyes stunned." Blade swallowed hard. "He talked about you until the day he died, Lieutenant Thompson. Said you taught him what true courage meant, not just in fighting, but in showing mercy to civilians when others wanted to take the easy way out." Sally wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. Tommy stood frozen, coffee pot in hand, as the story connected across generations in front of them. "My grandfather passed away last year," Blade continued, his tough guy facade completely gone now. "His last words to me were about Iwo Jima, about the lieutenant who led with both strength and compassion. I never thought—" He shook his head in disbelief. "I never thought I'd be standing here, disrespecting the very man who saved my grandfather's life." One by one, the other bikers removed their caps and leather jackets, revealing their own military insignias. Joey, the youngest member, stepped forward. "We're all veterans, sir," he said quietly. "Different wars, different times, but we're all Marines. We've been acting like everything we were taught to stand against." Frank looked at each of them, seeing not the troublemakers of the past weeks, but the soldiers they had been, and still were. "Sometimes," he said gently, "we forget who we are. The uniform comes off, but the responsibility to honor what it stands for never does." Blade knelt down and began picking up the pieces of Frank's broken coffee cup. "Sir, I know we can never undo what we've done here, but please—" He looked around at his gang, who all nodded in agreement. "Please let us make it right." The regular customers watched in amazement as the once intimidating bikers transformed before their eyes. Bob the mailman brought out his own military photos, and soon stories were being shared across generations of service members. Maria, the school teacher, quietly began taking notes. This was history coming alive, a lesson her students needed to hear. Sally brought out fresh coffee cups for everyone, including a new blue mug she'd been saving in the back, just in case Frank ever returned. Lieutenant Thompson, Blade said, standing at attention like his grandfather must have done decades ago. On behalf of all of us, I apologize for our dishonorable behavior. We forgot the code we lived by, the respect we owe to those who paved the way. Frank looked at the photograph of Hawk Miller one more time before handing it back to his grandson. Your grandfather would be proud to see you setting things right, son. That's what Marines do. We adapt, we overcome, and we never leave anyone behind. The morning sun now filled the diner completely, shining on veterans young and old, united by a bond that transcended decades and differences. What had started as confrontation had transformed into something none of them expected, a reminder of the brotherhood that never truly dies. As Blade helped Frank back into his jacket, the other patrons could see that Sally's diner would never be quite the same again, but maybe, just maybe, it would be even better. The transformation at Sally's diner happened faster than anyone could have expected. The very next morning, Blade gathered his entire group outside the diner at 6:30 a.m., 15 minutes before Frank's usual arrival time. Each biker had cleaned their leather jackets, polished their boots, and stood at attention like the soldiers they once were. When Frank's familiar figure appeared at the corner, walking slowly with his cane, Blade stepped forward. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he called out respectfully. "May we escort you to your booth, sir?" The other regulars watched in amazement as the once intimidating gang formed an honor guard, creating a path for Frank to walk through. Sally, watching from behind the counter, couldn't hold back her smile as she prepared Frank's new blue coffee cup. "First order of business," Blade announced to his group, "is making things right with everyone we've wronged." He turned to address the entire diner. "Starting today, the Road Warriors are here to protect, not intimidate. Any customer who feels unsafe in this town can count on us for an escort." Frank sat in his usual booth, now carefully cleaned and polished by the bikers. Joey, the youngest member, approached with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Lieutenant Thompson, we found someone who could restore this." Inside was Frank's Marine Corps pin, now professionally cleaned and mounted on a small display case with the Marine Corps motto engraved below, Semper Fidelis. The other bikers had spread out through the diner, personally apologizing to each regular customer they had frightened away. Maria, the school teacher, was surprised to find her coffee already paid for, along with a handwritten note of apology. Bob the mailman received a standing salute from the entire group. Blade pulled up a chair near Frank's booth, the way his grandfather might have done during quiet moments between battles. "Sir, my grandfather's journal mentioned something about a promise made in that cave on Iwo Jima. Would you tell us about it?" Frank's eyes grew distant with memory as other customers gathered around to listen. "Your grandfather and I made a pact," he began, his voice strong with purpose. "We promised that if we survived, we'd live our lives protecting others the way we protected those civilians. Hawk kept that promise until the day he died." The morning turned into an impromptu history lesson as Frank shared stories about Hawk Miller's bravery. The bikers hung on every word, seeing their own service reflected in tales of courage from decades past. Tommy, the busboy, started bringing extra chairs for other customers who wanted to listen. "From now on," Blade declared, standing to address his group, "we honor Lieutenant Thompson and my grandfather's legacy. Sally's Diner is under our protection, and so is every customer who walks through that door." The change in the bikers was remarkable. Their loud motorcycles were now parked far from the diner to avoid disturbing conversations. Their leather jackets, once meant to intimidate, became symbols of protection as they helped elderly customers with their bags and walked nervous passersby to their cars. One morning, a group of troublemakers from the next town tried to cause problems at the diner. They found themselves facing not just the Road Warriors, but a united front of veterans, regular customers, and community members who had become a family under Frank's quiet influence. Sally noticed more veterans starting to visit the diner, drawn by the stories they heard about Frank and the reformed bikers. The booth next to Frank's became an unofficial gathering place for service members of all ages, sharing experiences across generations. Blade made it his personal mission to document Frank's stories, recording them in a leather-bound journal just as his grandfather had done. "These stories need to be preserved," he explained. "They remind us what the uniform really stands for." The biggest surprise came when Blade and his group showed up one morning wearing new patches on their jackets. Below their Road Warriors insignia, they'd added the words Thompson's Guards along with the Iwo Jima flag-raising silhouette. "If it's all right with you, sir," Blade said to Frank, "we'd like to carry on what you and my grandfather started. Not just here at the diner, but throughout the community, protecting those who need protection, standing up for what's right." Frank looked at these changed men, seeing in them the same transformation he'd witnessed in young Marines decades ago, the moment when they understood that true strength came from serving others, not dominating them. The brotherhood that had been forged in a cave on Iwo Jima had found new life in a small-town diner, proving that some bonds never die. They just wait for the right moment to be renewed. Every Thursday morning at Sally's Diner became something special. The rumble of motorcycles would announce the arrival of Blade and his Road Warriors, now known throughout town as Thompson's Guards. They parked their bikes in a neat row, each one polished to military standards, and take their positions for what the townspeople had come to call Veterans Morning. Frank would arrive at his usual time, 6:45 a.m. sharp, but now he rarely had to walk from his house. The bikers took turns picking him up in a specially modified sidecar they'd attached to one of their motorcycles. They'd painted it Marine Corps blue and added custom handrails for safety. "Your chariot awaits, Lieutenant," Blade would say each Thursday, helping Frank settle into the sidecar with the respect of a grandson caring for his grandfather. The sight of a 93-year-old veteran cruising through town in a motorcycle sidecar, escorted by leather-clad bikers, became a source of joy for everyone who witnessed it. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The booth next to Frank's had been dedicated as a memorial space, with photographs of veterans from different eras displayed on the wall. Front and center was the picture of Hawk Miller, Blade's grandfather, standing next to a young Lieutenant Frank Thompson on Iwo Jima. Sally had embraced the change wholeheartedly. She created a special Veterans Morning menu with dishes named after different military operations. The Iwo Jima Special, Frank's usual breakfast of eggs, toast, and coffee, became the most popular order. Tommy, the busboy, had been inspired to join the Marine Corps Reserves, with Frank and the Road Warriors mentoring him through the process. "You're carrying on a legacy," Frank told him one morning, straightening Tommy's uniform before he left for training. The diner became a place where stories bridged generations. Young veterans shared experiences from recent conflicts, while older ones offered wisdom and understanding that only those who've served could provide. The Road Warriors made sure every veteran who walked through the door felt welcomed and respected. Maria, the school teacher, started bringing her history classes to the diner for special lessons. Students would sit quietly, captivated as Frank and the others shared first-hand accounts of events they'd only read about in textbooks. Blade would often add stories about his grandfather, keeping Hawk Miller's memory alive. One particularly memorable Thursday, the bikers surprised Frank by organizing a reunion of surviving Iwo Jima veterans. They'd spent months tracking down and arranging transportation for every veteran they could find. The diner could barely contain the emotions as old brothers in arms reunited, sharing memories and honoring those who hadn't made it home. The Road Warriors expanded their protective mission beyond the diner. They established a veteran support network, helping older veterans with home repairs, transportation to medical appointments, and companionship. Every member of the group took personal responsibility for checking on at least 3 veterans each week. Sally created a wall of honor near the entrance, displaying the military photos of regular customers who had served. Below Frank's photo, she placed a small plaque that read, "Every story of courage creates ripples that touch future generations. Lieutenant Frank Thompson, USMC." The biggest change was visible in the bikers themselves. Their leather jackets now carried multiple patches showing their commitment to veteran causes. They became fixtures at military funerals, standing guard in all weather to honor fallen brothers and sisters. Local children no longer feared them. Instead, they would wave excitedly whenever the Thompson's Guards rode past. Frank watched all of this with quiet pride. Each Thursday, as he sat in his booth surrounded by multiple generations of veterans, he'd think about Margaret and how much she would have loved seeing the diner filled with such brotherhood and purpose. One morning, as Blade helped Frank with his jacket, the old veteran pointed to the cave rescue scene tattooed on his arm. You know, son, he said softly, back then, we thought we were just saving 13 lives. But looking around the diner now, I realize something. Every act of courage and kindness creates a legacy that keeps on saving people long after the battle is over. The diner had become more than just a place to eat breakfast. It was a living memorial to service, sacrifice, and the power of redemption. The sound of motorcycle engines, once a source of tension, now brought smiles to people's faces. The leather-clad bikers, once feared, had become guardians of veterans' memories and protectors of their community. And every Thursday morning, as Frank Thompson enjoyed his coffee surrounded by his unlikely family of bikers and veterans, the spirit of Iwo Jima lived on in a small-town diner where brotherhood knew no boundaries of age or era.